Welcome to today's Bookworm. We are celebrating our 56th episode, and I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development here at the Clements Library. The Bookworm is brought to you by the Clements Library, and our mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to 1900. Just in case you haven't participated in our Zoom webinars before, we really do want this to feel like a conversation and something that you can participate in. So please chime in using the chat and change your setting to everyone so we can all see what you're writing. My colleagues Ann Bennington Helber and Kayla Robinson will also be putting in resources and links to the chat and monitoring the chat. However, if you have a question, put that in the Q&A section so that it stays together and we can find them again. You can also give a thumbs up to upvote any questions by others that you also have, so that will help reorder them. We have our live machine captions turned on today, so please feel free to toggle those on or off or change the size of the captions. And I can only control so much of what you see on the screen, but I do have side-by-side mode enabled today, so that should help you to change the size of the font, not the font, of the slides, and so just move that separator a little bit to get a better proportion. The University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. If you haven't clicked yet, click very quickly because I'm going to close today's poll question. I'm ending the poll. So it looks like based on the options that we gave, that novels have provided the most joy to people, with 45% of you choosing that as the single thing that you've read in your life that's brought the most joy. And it seems like some of the others are tied. The one person who selected essay has to tell us what essay, so that we know what we should all be reading. And if anyone else wants to share more about what they were thinking of as they answered this poll question, we'd love to have you do so in the chat. The University of Michigan Office of Academic and Multicultural Initiatives Juneteenth Symposium is currently underway. The theme of this year's event is Systems Check, Exploring Structural Solutions to Systemic Racism. Juneteenth events honor the progress of African Americans in the U.S. since the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, while continuing to recognize the ongoing efforts to overcome systemic injustices and inequities faced by Black communities. So check that out. We had the opportunity to view some of those presentations yesterday. So Today's episode of The Bookworm is sponsored by the University of Michigan Alumni Association. And as always, we thank you so much for your support. Before introducing today's speaker, I am going to turn it over to Paul Erickson, the Randolph G. Adams Director of the Clements Library, who will be in conversation with author and historian Tara Bynum. Paul received a BA in English from the University of Chicago and an MA and PhD in American Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Paul is currently president-elect of SHEAR, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. So Paul, I'll turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. And I am delighted to welcome my friend, Dr. Tara Bynum today. Professor Bynum is an assistant professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa and a scholar of early African American literary histories before 1800. She received her PhD in English from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in political science from Barnard College. Her book, Reading Pleasures, which is what we're going to talk about today, examines the ways in which 18th century enslaved and/or free men and women feel good or experience pleasure in spite of the privations of slavery, unfreedom, or white supremacy. Dr. Bynum's work has received and is indebted to generous financial support from the University of Pennsylvania's McNeil Center for Early American Studies Sabbatical Fellowship, Washington College's CV Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience, and the John Carter Brown Library, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia's Program in African American History, and Rutgers University's Department of English. And it is wonderful to be in conversation about the pleasure of reading today, since this book, Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America, is such a tremendous pleasure to read. And there's a discount code on the slides right now. Order this book and read it. It is absolutely fantastic. So I will turn things over to you, Tara, and then we will have a conversation and we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Paul and Angela and the rest of the Clements Library, of course, for bringing me here today. I'm super excited to be in conversation and to talk about my book. Thank you to the audience for coming out to hear this conversation and participating in, I think, which should be a delightful kind of event. So Reading Pleasures, I would say, is a book with many origin stories. And I have been thinking about kind of which origin story that makes the most sense to share. I think there's a way to talk about this book and kind of connected to my graduate school research. There's a way to talk about this book as a very sort of recent project that kind of began about 7 years or so ago. There's I think a way to kind of go back even further. I think it seems most fitting is the more recent story of this book. I remember kind of talking about it with Paul, actually, and I think Paul for sure is among those who kind of helped encourage this book to become a book and to become a physical object, not just an idea in my mind, but an actual thing that you can hold and touch and read. So I'm certainly kind of indebted to Paul for that encouragement, and also kind of helping me land at the American Antiquarian Society to do some much needed research and writing on it. But the kind of from that kind of moment at the American Antiquarian Society, I think what emerges more fully and clearly to me is this project that has me examining these 4 Black writers, Phillis Wheatley, John Marrant, James Albert Ukawsaw, Graniosa, and David Walker. And what I find striking about all 4 of them is that they have a very real sort of easy to read, in my view, easy to spot kind of interest in feeling good. I think that they use language too that makes it apparent. And it's not necessarily that I'm reading against the grain or kind of discovering something new, but instead, I think what I find as I read, Wheatley's poems and letters, as I read the narratives of Graniosa and Marron, and as I read Walker's Appeal, is that the language of feeling good is present. They use words like happy, they use words like pleased, words that mean and certainly gesture towards good feeling. And they do so in very sort of different ways, which also felt very important to me. So Wheatley in her poems makes kind of reference to a dreaming lover. There's also the letters between Uber Tanner and Phyllis Wheatley, where it's clear that she is delighting in the correspondence with her friend, who's also an enslaved woman, Uber Tanner. I think Graniosa and Marron are writing of these spiritual and conversion narratives. And for both men, that faith in God is so important and apparent, and there's so much joy that they derive from their faith and their relationship to God and God's relationship to them. And then there's David Walker, who I think for folks who have read Walker, I think he's known for his anger, but I think that the anger is just a piece of the puzzle. Walker uses that anger to mobilize his, what he calls the kind of his colored brethren, the colored citizens of the world. He wants them to use that anger to create the world anew, to make the United States a completely different country, one in which they can be equal citizens. And it's that moment, the moment where the country is made anew, that is the source of kind of the happiness that he imagines for this community. And I guess as I kind of did the research and the writing for this book, I also was kind of keenly aware of the fact that so often when we imagine the lives of Black people in centuries past, those lives don't have much in the way of feeling good. And I knew that there was some risk in talking about good feeling, because I think so often the fear is, if you mention the good feeling, then that must mean they enjoyed slavery too. And that is not my intention in any way. But instead, I guess what I wanted to get at is the very certainty that Black people are and have been able to experience a multitude of feelings in spite of, alongside of, kind of the reality of systemic oppression, enslavement, freedom, or something kind of tentatively known as freedom. So I think it has felt kind of very important to the project to make clear that, my intervention is meant to include yet another way of understanding Black people as historical persons that experience a very complex set of feelings and a range of feelings. And I think my aim and hope is to basically ensure that when we think about this past, when we imagine this past, there's a way to kind of access the multitude of experiences so that there's a greater inclination to represent that variability of experience. So I guess it's, in my view, it's not all or nothing, but instead, there's a book like Reading Pleasures, there's discussions of the harms of enslavement. There's also other sorts of pursuits that I can't even yet imagine. And I think that certainly this work is born out of my own sort of desire to, I guess, see myself represented in the scholarship. I'm not above the kind of research as me search. And I guess what I kind of got to thinking about at some point very early on was like, if I had to think about my own experience as a Black woman in the 21st century, if someone looked at my life 300 years from now, would they kind of talk about the realities of racism and sexism exclusively, or would they be able to, also speak to there's so much more that makes me who I am. And I guess that's what I wanted to do, was who else is Phyllis Wheatley besides the enslaved girl poet who publishes a book of poems? You know, who are Graniosa and Marrant? Yeah, besides 18th century men, one of whom was enslaved, Graniosa, one of whom was born free. But, you know, is there another way to kind of think of them other than kind of victims of white supremacy? David Walker is angry. There's no doubt about it. His punctuation makes that clear. You know, shout out to the work of Marcy Dinius. You know, and yet what else is David Walker looking to do in that book besides be angry? What else is he appealing for? You know, and I wanted to pursue all of that. And I wanted to pursue it while having in mind kind of the very real sort of certainty that they must have experienced more, felt more, and been capable of very real sorts of connections. And I think that that's actually evident in the work. So, you know, I think if I had to think about this project in terms of takeaways for myself, you know, I think that there's certainly what felt important was realizing the extent to which, like, reading what was there on the page was just as important as kind of reading between the lines and reading against the grain. And, you know, I guess I wanted to take these writers, Wheatley, Graniosa, Marron, and Walker, at their word. I wanted to take seriously what they were saying. And when I did that, I was able to kind of hear them in different ways and to see them in different ways, and to complicate the assumptions that I certainly had as a graduate student when I first encountered them in Professor Michael Moon's graduate seminar. You know, I think that it was powerful for me to realize what I wanted them to do was not necessarily what they did. And, you know, I think a research question that kind of emerged was like, why didn't they do what I wanted them to do? Why wasn't kind of the resistance that I hoped for back in graduate school present in their writing? And instead of, you know, I guess the answer to that question kind of led me to wondering and pursuing what they did say. And so often what they did say was, I'm happy, I'm pleased, I'm, you know, delighted, I am, you know, feeling good. I might not have literally said I'm feeling good, but, you know, I think that they use language that kind of made that clear. So Reading Pleasures is my exploration of these four writers, the possibility and very certainty of their good feeling. And my hope is that readers will see this as a point of entry into another sort of perspective alongside the many others that have been offered, of Black people's experiences in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So with that said, thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to talk more.
Thank you so much, Tara. That's fantastic. Just to start, so I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with Phyllis Wheatley, and probably also with David Walker. And if people have not read David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, go read it. It is one of the great books of the 19th century United States. But people are probably maybe less familiar with John Marrant and James Gronniosaw. So can you talk a little bit about who they are and sort of their stories?
So absolutely, Graniosa and Marrant are certainly much lesser known, but I think for the 18th century reader, Marrant for sure, I think his book is wildly successful. So John Marrant, I'll start with him, was born, I think in 1755 in upstate New York. He's born free. And his mother, and this is, somebody has got to figure this out. I read a dissertation that gets at it a little teeny bit, but doesn't stay there. His mother takes the whole family to St. Augustine, Florida. And when he's about 4 or 5 years old. So they moved to St. Augustine, Florida, and then they kind of meander through Georgia and settle in Charleston, South Carolina. And this all comes out in his narrative, which is published in 1785. And the narrative itself is very much a conversion narrative. So the aim is to kind of represent his life as a sinner who ultimately finds Jesus. And he finds Jesus by way of a George Whitefield sermon. George Whitefield kind of points his finger at him. He falls out and kind of gives his life over to Christ after. And the rest of the narrative is about kind of the way that he is delivered repeatedly. And he ends up kind of involved in the Countess of Huntington's Methodist connection. So he goes to England, he goes to Boston, he ends up in Nova Scotia for a stretch. He's also a loyalist. So he definitely has a very kind of amazing sort of story that I don't know has been entirely wrestled with, but is utterly fascinating. And then there's James Albert Ukawsaw Graniosa, who also writes a conversion narrative. And he writes his narrative kind of living in England, and his family is not doing well financially. So he writes his narrative because he needs to make money for his family that's living in England. And he too is kind of connected to the Countess of Huntington. He's born in West Africa, is enslaved and journeys the Middle Passage, ends up in kind of the New York, New Jersey area, if I'm remembering correctly. And he too has a moment of like finding Christ and believing Jesus to be his Lord and Savior. And I guess what follows as well is his kind of, the various ways that God kind of delivers him and saves him kind of repeatedly up until, this moment where he is in need of money. Interestingly enough, if we had to think about age, John Marrant dies when he's about in his early 30s. And Graniosa is about, I think, 60 or so when he publishes his narrative.
Right. And there's one other person who I think probably nobody in our audience will be terribly familiar with, who was really kind of the emotional heart of the book for me, and that's Ober Tanner. Can you talk a little bit about her and who she was?
So Ober Tanner Ober Tanner, I feel like might pull on my heartstrings as well. I am fascinated by this woman. She is, she lives in Newport, Rhode Island, and is enslaved to James and Hannah Hazard Tanner. She at some point meets Wheatley and becomes friends with Wheatley. How that happens is not necessarily known, but the two of them write letters back and forth to one another. And Ober Tanner is the one who kind of keeps these letters, which is why we know who Ober Tanner is. And also that, Phyllis Wheatley has at least one friend, even though I suspect that she has more than that. And Ober Tanner, Wheatley dies in 1784. Ober Tanner lives until 1835 and just has a robust life. She becomes the president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Free African Union Society in Newport. She marries a man named Barry Collins. At some point, when Barry Collins dies, she becomes a property owner, and kind of his will gives her his house. There's so many pieces of this story that I'm still kind of trying to put together to kind of better get a sense of who she is, because there's so much that isn't yet known. And I don't know where the line between like, it's because she's not present in the archive. And also, I don't know that many people have looked, because Phyllis Wheatley is the go-to. Phyllis Wheatley is the Library of Congress subject heading. Phyllis Wheatley is the one who this entire year, institutions and universities are celebrating the 250th anniversary of her book. But Ober Tanner, just doesn't have that level of fanfare around her. But she is a very good friend of Phyllis Wheatley.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about her in in a bit when we talk about kind of the challenges of researching this project. But was thinking about how the project started, was there a moment when you were reading one of these writers when it sort of clicked that they were talking about pleasure and joy and that they actually meant it? Was there something that was sort of like, oh, like, yeah, they are, they're not doing what I expect them to be doing?
Well, I think the very first click was reading about the dreaming lover sighing in Thoughts on the Works of Providence. And also reading the work of Catherine Clay Bassard. So like when wed together, Catherine Clay Bassard, who is reading the poems and the letters, and then I am returned to the poems like, wait, she does mention ardor. She does talk about this dreaming lover. Like, what's happening? I guess I become that much more aware of the language that Wheatley is using. So I think that, as a grad, and I'm a graduate student, kind of when this is happening, like I'm busy looking for the fight. I'm looking for the language that proves the fight and missing this other language that is very apparent. I feel like she's always blooming. I feel like there's so much language that suggests at the very least, maybe some form of arousal, and I think once I landed on The Dreaming Lover, I said, I got to read Thoughts on the Works of Providence that much more closely. And then when I kind of learned that the letters existed and that they weren't hard to find because they were in the back of the Penguin edition that I had, as I read the letters between Uber Tanner and Phillis Wheatley, I was like, oh, like, I think that she might be excited to get letters from her friend. Like, why is kind of Catherine Clay Bassard the only one who has yet to like dive deep into this relationship? At least that was true at the time. So I think it was that moment that then had me kind of pursue this good feeling in these other places. And I think that once I realized that calling everything written in narrative form, written by Black people, like slave narratives, once I realized that was inadequate, especially in the 18th century, and thought about Graniosa and Marron as conversion narratives or kind of spiritual autobiographies, I think that also kind of helped me land on, like, they might just believe that Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior, and they might take that seriously. And if you believe that premise, and then, like, what all might you think was possible? And I think that helped me to read their narratives, like not in pursuit of irony, but instead like, oh, they're getting saved on ships and they are making it across oceans, and they are kind of seeing opportunity where there might not be any, and they have decided that God is creating that opportunity. Like, yeah, that feels good, so I think the kind of origin story, though, of the pursuit of good feeling was absolutely Thoughts on the Works of Providence and reading Catherine Clay Bassard.
So I want to talk a little bit more about religion, because it's so incredibly important in the lives of all four of the writers that you talk about here. And it's especially for Wheatley, Marrant, and Gronniosaw, like their religious faith is the thing that gives them pleasure and joy. And reading the Bible is that's the primary thing they read that gives them joy. And contemporary literary scholars and historians are often kind of uncomfortable talking about religious belief in that way. And I remember taking a class in religious history in college, and the professor said, the first thing you have to understand is that when people in the past say they believe something, they really believed it. And so that's I think the key thing that you do in your approach to these writers. But it's a very specific kind of religion. It's it's a Whitefieldian, revivalist, Protestant Christianity, kind of at the cusp of Calvinism and Methodism. and it's really focused on what Whitefield refers to as the indwelling of the spirit, right?
Yeah.
That it's this interiority, the internal experience of your faith in Christ that is the thing that shows that you're saved. So why is it hard, aside from sort of the usual, like, we live in a secular age explanations, like, why is it hard for scholars now to take that seriously as a source of joy for people in the past, especially for Black people?
Well, I think that for the sorts of conversations that I've had about this, like, I think that like it's still an underlying idea that Christianity was coercive, and I think that might be true. And also in the way of kind of humanity, there's a paradox there in that at whatever point it might have been coercive, there also becomes a point of belief. And I think really I ended up, and I can remember this moment, like thinking about my grandmother, who was definitely a churchy Black woman. And I think as I was reflecting on her and her faith, I was like, there's no way that I could tell her that this is a coerced perspective. There's no way that I could convince her that she should not believe in her God, And I guess I then wondered, like, why should I? Why should I have that sort of perspective that somehow she is inadequate or her faith is inadequate? And I guess once I sort of thought through that with her, I then was like, well, then why should I think that Marrant and Graniosa and Walker and Wheatley are equally as kind of incapable of their own beliefs, So, I guess I kind of wanted to take their faith seriously because it was so much a part of the writing, and I think Walker is included in this too. I think Walker understands that his project will be successful because God has chosen his people very specifically, so I think that I guess I wanted to just like honor what they had said and like believe what they had said. And I think when I did that, like so much more of the text opened up. Because if I had spent my time kind of fighting against their faith, the text would have just been opaque. It would have been impenetrable to some extent. And, I think I would have missed the ways that, like, for Graniosa and Marrant, they're using Bible stories to shape their own life. At some point I was like, what exactly is truth? Because that's definitely a Bible story there. Or even thinking about like Wheatley's letters. Like there's so many Bible verses that aren't cited. And they're not cited, I imagine, because Tanner knows what they are. So there's no need for the citation. She didn't have to have a whole bibliography attached. And same with Marron and Graniosa. Their readers know that, oh, that's pulled from a Bible story. And that's kind of part of the genre itself, I would argue, is like being able in the kind of using the conversion narrative form to kind of demonstrate what one knows about the Bible and the depth of their faith by way of their understanding of Bible stories. And so I understand certainly why Christianity is understood to be kind of a religion that was used as a tool of coercion. And also I understand that people actually become very real believers, and they live their lives believing in the kind of believing in their Christian faith and like needing it, to make sense of the world around them. And I guess I wanted to hear that.
Yeah, it's I think it's so it's so important to understand the level of familiarity that everybody in the American 18th century had with scripture, and that you don't have to say what this is a reference to. This is where the story's from, because everybody would have known.
Yeah.
So you talked a bit about how this book is kind of an intervention into the historiography of Black people in America and African American literary history, and about the risk of when you write about Black people in this period feeling good or being happy, that it can verge into the historiographic tradition from the late 19th, early 20th century of, slavery was good for Africans, and, Christianizing them was, a good justification for slavery. And, there are a lot of historians who wrote books like that, and some of them taught here at the University of Michigan. And then to the mid-century reaction against that, people like Orlando Patterson saying, slavery is social death. And you quote Irving Howe in the book about African American literature, saying that misery is the condition that all Black writers are responding to. So can you talk a little bit about sort of how that historiographic approach informed how you went about writing this book?
Yeah, I remember a conversation somewhat vividly with a colleague who, asked me what my book was about or what I was interested in. And, I gave my pitch that had been cultivated over years. Like I'm writing about the way Black people feel good in the 18th century. And she was like, why? I was like, well, because I think they have something to say. And she was like, I mean, like, why would you do that? Why would you set yourself up to be accused of saying that they were happy slaves? And I was like, well, first and foremost, I'm not saying that. Secondly, not everybody was enslaved that I talk about. So let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was an interesting moment because I, in other ways, have had these kind of conversations which would suggest, how do you know that Phyllis Wheatley was capable of humor? How do you know that they could have felt good? What if there's a contingency of people who says that you're calling Black people happy slaves? And I think I just landed on, like, that's a risk that I'm willing to take, to be misunderstood in that way, because the larger project still feels so important to me, which is to make sure that we understand when looking at the past that at no point have Black people not been capable of complex emotions and a range of them, and I think that in a weird way, the kind of the limitation of this emotional limitation that is imposed upon 18th century Black people sounds like Thomas Jefferson, I think, in Notes on the State of Virginia, and so many of his contemporaries that are like, oh, they can't blush, they're not human, and I guess I want to kind of certainly push back at what Thomas Jefferson is saying, but also push back at the way that I guess maybe fear of has shaped our ability to ask questions. And, I think I understand kind of how we get to the literature that you cite. I understand kind of the scholarship that is in reaction to and in response to like a longstanding kind of tradition of reading or not reading Black people well. And I also want to say that, like, well, let's now add to that. I think that we are in a position present day to add to the conversation and to say, like, it's okay to make and represent Black people as complicated and also kind of emotionally capable of holding, like, the various paradoxes required of living in these United States. I think too, and this is also born out of a selfish idea. I was talking to a friend of mine one day who is also a Black woman. And, I think as we were talking, in the back of my mind, as one does when they have a long-standing research project, I was thinking like someone wanted to represent my conversation with this other Black woman, 300 years from now. And what they talked about was the resistance that we were engaging in on this phone call. Like, I guess it's resistance, but we were probably just talking about, I don't know, how the Ravens are better than the Cincinnati Bengals, like, and maybe that's a conversation about resistance, or it might just be like
Right.
that it's football season, and I think that in some respects, both might be true. And I guess I would want that researcher 300 years from now to understand that both are possible, both can happen in the lives of not just me, but also Black people more generally. And I think that, as I've said kind of like before, like what happens when we open up that possibility? Like what else might we see? What else might we get access to in thinking about the past? And, I think, at the risk of now sounding like someone who was born in the 1900s, I think every year that my students have gotten younger, they've pushed back when like Black people and I'll just say joy in the like language of present day, like they've also pushed forward, I guess, when Black people in joy could happen. So like when they were born in the late 80s and early 90s, like it was at the end of the 20th century that it could happen. But now that they're born all in the 21st century, largely, like then Blackness and joy can only go together in the 21st century. And because I was born in the 1900s and have in fact been happier before the birth of my students, it almost is imperative to me to be like, no, like this is not, like I don't want this to get later and later and suddenly it's like 2050 and my students are like, oh, this is an invention of the mid 21st century. Like this is not real. What are you all talking about? Yeah, so I think that too has felt very important to me as I, I'm helping to like train up students, whether they go and get PhDs in English or live their lives in other ways. Like I think I want them at the very least to carry with them that Black people have felt good for centuries, and have had friends and have had parties and have done things that look like fun, even present day, and we should talk about that, or at least be willing to acknowledge it, alongside the kind of realities of white supremacy.
Yeah. So since a lot of the folks who listen to the Bookworm tune in because they are connected to the Clements Library in some way and they care about libraries and archives, I think the coda to your book is so incredibly moving because it touches on questions about the archive and about the difficulty of doing research on someone like Uber Tanner, who doesn't leave a lot of traces, and what we can conclude. And I just want to read a short passage from the coda. You write, Tanner compels me to ask of my assumptions, what if silence or even death aren't the limits of the archive? What if silence can beget new ways of reading, new points of entry into a reading practice that takes up this silence and pictures its resulting pleasures? How do we read for the living in places that we have decided are for the dead? And that's so powerful to me because so often the reaction to people not finding somebody in their research, not finding what they're looking for, is just say, well, they're not here. The powerful people who have created the archive over the centuries have written them out. And your approach, I think, is so valuable because you're asking questions about, well, what can we know even without the written evidence? What can we know about people's humanity that will let us say things about them? So can you talk a bit about that approach and maybe what you feel like its limits are in archival research?
Well, I think that because the archive has had a moment for the kind of several years at this point, I think that there's so many conversations about the archive. And I think the essay that you wrote that was kind of critical of the language of the archive, I think gets me started kind of thinking about the archive in more sort of nuanced ways, and gets me to confront my own assumptions about what the archive is. Like it's an actual word that means things, and there are archivists and librarians that are doing very specific sorts of work that are different than the way that I'm deploying the word, and I think that though I'm forgetting the title of it, pardon me, it certainly was
lovingly critical. That's what
it was an essay that kind of had me like, wait, I need to think about this space a bit more complicatedly. And, I think the more time that I spent in kind of archives, I was, kind of both confronted with what I found. So there was a lot more than what I expected. I expected there to be a real lack. And then, of course, there were times when I did not find the answers to the questions that I had. And that then became like whose fault is that sort of question for me? Mm-hmm. So I want to know how Uber Tanner and Phyllis Wheatley meet. That's not in a letter. That might be what we call a silence. But if we think about Phyllis Wheatley and Uber Tanner, why would they need to talk about when they met? They know when they met. So whose fault is it for not knowing it? It ends up being mine, not that this is a blame game, but I think that, like, is that an archival silence, or is it business that's not mine to know? Right. And that is what I kind of have increasingly sort of wrestled with, is like, whose business is it to know? And when is it my business to pursue a certain line of questioning? Now, of course, I am an 18th century researcher. I always think it is my business, in fact. So I'm certainly, I don't ask the question because then that's supposed to mean for me that I stopped doing the work. No, but instead I use it as a way to think about what all is possible. So when there is a question that I can't answer around the life of Uber Tanner, like, what is it that I'm supposed to know about Uber Tanner, and what is it that I'm not supposed to know? And I think that oftentimes there's a presumption that the folks who we have decided don't have the right sorts of access to the archive. I think that there's a presumption that they don't then know how to engage with their own legacy. And I think that is, I don't think that quite gets it right. So if I had to think about someone like Uber Tanner and these letters, she keeps her friends' letters, she gives them to her pastor's wife. And I think that it's a very intentional sort of gifting. She's at the end of her life. I think she knows that her friend at the very least is important, and that these letters are important. Then at some point I had to ask the question, like, does Uber Tanner give all her letters? Mm-hmm. This is her pastor's wife. I think folks have commented, certainly in class, but I think in other sorts of places, and have written about like the churchiness of those letters. And are they churchy because she gave them to her pastor? Like, she picked the churchy letters to give to her pastor's wife, but the ones where she's, maybe a bit gossipy, the ones where she's talking about who's cute, like, did those make it? And we may never know. But I think that, I guess the question for me was like, why would I assume that Tanner would not be intentional about the letters that she gives to her pastor's wife? Like, I mean, does everybody get to see your text messages? Probably not, and so then I guess I just started wondering more and more about like the possibility that part of what we can't find might be, in fact, because people don't want to be found. And then what does that tell us? Yeah, what does that tell us? And what information is there? I always use this example because I think it works so well. The state of Maryland, which is where I am at physically right this second, has this database. It's called Case Search. And it is comprised of all of the like legal cases that you can have, from criminal to civil to tort, whatever that is, like all kinds of cases. And, if I had to go to my future researcher again 300 years from now, guess where I don't want that researcher to find me?
Right.
I don't want to be in the case search database. And I am, kind of aware of it. I am aware of the state apparatus. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be anywhere near case search. And Maryland's case search, like, it's all of your business that shows up. Other states, they make it hard. Maryland makes it very easy. And if anyone gets to Googling and is curious, like, it's only speeding tickets that you'll find for me. I have sometimes I can go fast. But I think that I don't even want to have speeding tickets. So if I am capable of having that thought, why wouldn't someone in centuries past also think that way? And also, why wouldn't they be mindful of what was kept in, what wasn't kept in their name? And I think that, like, that's not a late 1900s phenomenon, because that's when I was born. Like, it's something else.
Yeah,
I think it's just human.
I could talk with you all day about this book, but I want to turn it over to Angela for some housekeeping comments, and then we will take questions from the audience. So if you have questions for Professor Bynum, please put them in the Q&A.
All right, that was really interesting. So thank you. And I just wanted to put up this promo code one more time in case people weren't on the program or hadn't noticed it, but we'll also include it in the email that everybody receives with the recording later today. Yesterday, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Clements Library. It was our actual founding day. And so all year we've been talking about our centennial. So I hope that if you're in the area, you'll come by the Clements Monday through Friday between noon and 4 to see our latest exhibit, Building on a Century of Collecting at the Clements Library. And you can also view an extended version of this exhibit online. It helps to answer some questions about how it is that we go about deciding what to collect at the Clements. So looking at some of the acquisitions that were made in the first 75 years, and then pairing those with an item that has been acquired in the last 25, just to give you an idea about how we, how the research priorities sometimes fluctuate, how we go about building out those things that we're well known for, and how we fill in the gaps. So I hope you'll take a look at that or come by and see us. Next week, we will be saying farewell to Clayton Lewis, our longtime curator of graphics materials at the Clements Library. So please join us for a retirement celebration in Clayton's honor. We'll have, of course, some food and camaraderie, and then a panel discussion. And everyone who has signed up for the Bookworm receives an email monthly reminding you about the next Bookworm. So you're already signed up if you'd like to join us live again, or you'll receive, as I mentioned, a recording afterwards. In July, we'll be welcoming Allison Stagg, who is a researcher and lecturer in the Department of Architecture and Art History at the Technical University of Darmstadt, Germany. And she'll be discussing her book, Prints of a New Kind, Political Caricature in the United States, 1789 to 1828. So we hope you'll join us again. And I'd like to thank the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan once again for sponsoring today's episode of the Bookworm. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode, you can always contact myself or Ann Bennington Helper, and we appreciate everything everyone does to support the Clements, including being here today. All right, Paul, we're ready for questions.
Great. So the first comment is from Ivy, who says that the fact that you have to defend this approach to describing Black life in a scholarly book says a lot about how far academia has to go to be free of these beliefs about the full humanity of Black people in the past. And can you talk a bit about sort of any resistance that you've encountered to this approach that you take in the book?
So I think that what I've had is like these conversations that I mentioned. So the conversation that says, you know, hey, do you want to talk about good feeling? That seems risky. Or I think there was one conversation that I had with a woman who I was saying that Phyllis Wheatley tells a joke in a letter, and very explicitly tells a joke. So she might tell some inside jokes that I don't know, but there's one moment where, like, for sure she is telling a joke. And I remember the question was like, how do you know she's telling a joke? She might just, you know, it might not be a joke. And I was like, well, she kind of says I'm telling a joke a little bit, you know? So I'm once again going to take her at her word. So I think that the kind of interpersonally, I've had conversations that suggest a critique of my way of thinking about these writers, but kind of in a kind of larger, more institutional sense. I think there's just been a lot of excitement, which is great.
So the next question is from our mutual friend, Kelly Weisskopf. Thanks for joining us. So she's wondering about the different genres in which you read expressions of joy. So you mentioned poetry and letters, and also obviously scripture. And she's wondering about the range of genres the book considers, and if there were any genres that you were surprised to read in your research where you found these expressions of joy and pleasure.
I think it was David Walker's appeal was probably the big one. And I get to David Walker's appeal because, you know, I'm 19th century hesitant, as is well documented.
Come on.
By way of Jordan Stein. Jordan Stein is a big advocate for David Walker's appeal. And it's like, you should do something with David Walker's appeal. And I had decided to read it again and was like, oh, there is something interesting happening here. So if I had to think about the various genres that are included, you know, you've got the poetry, letters, the narratives, the appeal. But David Walker's appeal was the one that maybe surprised me the most. Because I certainly had read Walker's appeal as like, oh, David Walker's angry, and rightfully so. But I think I kind of missed largely what Walker was doing. Yeah.
Right. And he is angry. All
he's
the
definitely
time.
Angry.
In fascinating ways. So Janet has a question about whether there's a correlation between the ability to read and write and the ability to have these kinds of moments of pleasure among African Americans in the 18th century. Sort of how does literacy figure into the kinds of pleasure that you're writing about here?
So I think that for the writers that I am talking about, who are, you know, like loosely canonical, of Walker and Wheatley are the most well-known, but you can still get anthologies with Graniosa and Marron in them too. And I kind of picked them because they are so popular. And I kind of didn't want anyone to think that I had found something that was obscure and therefore could not speak more generally about kind of the literature. I think that so in picking them and picking folks who are kind of canonical, like they have published books, they are literate, and you know, I think that as the woman with the PhD in English, like I think that it is very easy for me to be book centric. I guess what I don't want to do is presume that literacy is the only way to kind of access the joy that I'm talking about. I think that it's the only way for me to access it, because how else are they going to represent it? It has to be written down by them or by someone so that I can then read it and tell you about it. So I think that this to me feels like a slightly tricky question, because I don't want to presume that if there's, literacy is not as commonplace in the 18th century as it is now, I wouldn't want to presume that the only way to access these feelings on the part of the Black people who is experiencing them is limited to reading. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the book is called Reading Pleasures, so I think you're talking about a specific kind of pleasure, and that doesn't foreclose
Right.
other ways
Yeah.
of being good.
And what I wanted to kind of also get at by way of the book is like the kind of everydayness of pleasure, and I think for them, the four that I'm talking about, like reading is part of it, but it is not the only way that they derive pleasure.
Yeah. Scotty Parrish has a question about whether Christianity was compelled for Black Americans in the 18th century. So her question has to do with the way in which Protestantism of the Great Awakening and slightly after this sort of really revivalist Protestant Christianity involves such constant tribulation of conscience and unworthiness. And she writes that Graniosa, Marrant, and Equiano all wrestle in their narratives with the unknowability of salvation. This question of how can I know if I'm saved? So can you put that that tribulation and anxiety in connection with the kind of religious pleasure that they feel?
Well, I think that their stories are also very much kind of connected to repeatedly being saved, like in a literal sense. So, I think at some point, I think it's Marron is on a ship and he might get thrown overboard, but then ends up back on the ship. Like he has multiple near-death experiences and does not die. And I think he connects that to like God saving him kind of repeatedly. So I think this is an interesting question because I haven't quite admittedly thought about it in this way exactly. But I will say that, I think having some level of anxiety around one's faith seems to be a part of the what faith is. And yet I think what's also part of it is like the way that kind of God kind of consistently intervenes on behalf of those who are saved, at least in the context of Christianity. And I think that that's what they keep kind of reminding themselves of and reminding the audience of, and I think that that is kind of built into their commitment to the form itself. The kind of conversion narrative form, like the point is to talk about how you sinned first, and then once you find God, how God shows up repeatedly. So I guess I would just say that tension to me seems part of what demonstrates their faithfulness.
Right. I think you talk about really really wonderfully in both the cases of Marrant and Graniosa, how the thing that makes them feel saved is a feeling of worth, that it's that interior sense that that God has of God's love, and that God has deemed them worthy of love. And that's the same thing that Walker says is going to save the colored citizens of the United States, is when they realize that they are worth being full and equal citizens of this country.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I stand by that.
I think it's a really great through line. So Deb has a question. She says your approach reminds her of the novels of Toni Morrison. You're not afraid to share the full humanity of people whose lives have been drawn into very narrow spaces. Will your future work continue this approach? So that was another question I had. What are you working on next, and how is it going to incorporate this approach that you lay out in this book?
I think Toni Morrison doesn't know this, but Toni Morrison might be like my arch nemesis, only because every time I think a thought, read something of Toni Morrison. I watched something, an interview with Toni Morrison, and she literally has had the thought that I just had, but will have had it in like 1972. And it's like, oh my God, Toni Morrison. Ugh. Alas, it's not a competition, but alas. Anyways, so my work is certainly informed by Toni Morrison. And I think I absolutely will kind of continue this approach. I am currently obsessed with an 18th century community, Black community in Newport, Rhode Island. And I don't quite have a good hook or pitch just yet, but there's something there. There's something that about them that has me curious and kind of in pursuit of their stories. And I think that what I have also learned there is that these sorts of good feelings that I'm interested in are also present in the work that they leave behind too. So, I think my favorite thing to talk about is Caesar Linden's Sundry account book, which includes this pig roast. And, friends come to the pig roast, there's a bunch of rum, there's a bunch of wine. They're going to make rum punch. There are limes for the punch. There's sugar for the punch. It's set to be a feast. And, upon looking at it and, Lisa Tardif and the folks at the Rhode Island Historical Society put me onto it, I was like, wait, how do we talk about this? This is clearly a party. And Caesar Linden is enslaved, and the other folks that are listed on his side of the guest list are also enslaved too. So, that's just kind of one example of the stuff that I have found, or not found, but like read as part of this community. Yeah.
I was going to ask you to talk about the pig roast if you didn't mention it, because
oh my God, the pig roast. The pig roast is amazing. It's August 12th, 1766. So, it's in the midst of like the colony's debates around the various acts that they don't like, with the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, all of them. And he on the receipt for this pig roast, he lists out all of the food that he's purchased. And when you think about those acts, like some of this food should not be as available as it is. So there's a whole nother sort of conversation about like, Rhode Island and its bad habits around customs. Yeah, as well as, like, can limes grow in Rhode Island is a question, I mean, Abraham Redwood has an orchard that includes limes. I'm just saying. So it's a fascinating sort of document. And I think one of many that are part of this Black Rhode Island community that are still extant and have not quite been like teased out a ton.
Right.
So
and that speaks to the question that we had about sort of pleasure and literacy. And like, this is a moment where
yeah.
we actually know the date of a party that a bunch of enslaved people in Rhode Island had. And that can't be the only one that happened.
Right. I don't think it is the only one that happened. Right. And I don't know if anybody could read, and I don't know if anybody was reading at the party.
Right.
Right. And it didn't seem like a reading party, if I'm honest. Like it doesn't give me those vibes. Like, no. I don't think anybody had their books with them.
No, it seemed like a party.
I think it seemed like a party. Yeah. Like the amount of food alone. Like, I want to know how big the pig was, but I haven't been able to figure that out. Like, how many people are we talking about for real?
Yeah. Well, this has been so great talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And Angela, do you have anything else to close us out?
I do not have anything else to close us out except to say thank you to Tara and to say this was amazing and a great way to start the weekend.
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming through and being part of the conversation. Thank you to Paul and Angela and Ann and Kayla for making this a smooth sort of webinar.
Yeah. It's always so much fun to talk to you. I hope to see you again soon, and everybody have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.